Welcome to Historical Sleep Stories. Before tonight's journey begins, let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and let the day drift quietly away. Tonight, we travel to Edinburgh Waverley Station on a misty autumn evening in 18. The gas lamps of Edinburgh Waverley glowed amber through a fine autumn mist as Isobel Cranmore stepped onto the platform, her wooden paintbox balanced against her hip and a soft leather satchel of sketchbooks slung over one shoulder. The station breathed with the low hiss of steam and the murmur of porters calling out platform numbers, their voices rising and falling like a slow tide beneath the great glass roof far above. Somewhere a bell rang twice, unhurried, and a trolley of trunks rattled past on old iron wheels, its sound echoing briefly and then fading into the general soft roar of the evening. She had never travelled north alone before, and there was a quiet thrill in it. Not fear exactly, but the particular lightness of a woman setting out at last to see something entirely her own, unshared, unhurried, chosen for no one's sake, but hers alone. Above her, the vast arched roof of glass caught the last silver light of dusk, scattering it in long, trembling lines across the wet stone platform, and for a moment she simply stood still and let the whole grand, sighing machinery of the station move gently around her, unbothered, patient, in no rush at all to begin. Somewhere down the platform, a mother settled a sleepy child into a compartment, and further off, a newspaper seller called his last headlines of the evening into the cooling air. Isobel breathed it all in slowly, coal smoke, damp stone, the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts from a cart near the entrance, and felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely and pleasantly alone with her own thoughts. She found her carriage at last, third from the engine, its brass door handle cold beneath her glove, and climbed the small step up into the warm, lamp-lit compartment, setting her paint box carefully on the rack above and her satchel beside her on the cushioned seat. Outside, the whistle sounded its first long call into the evening air, thin and clear, drifting up past the glass roof and out into the darkening sky above the city, and somewhere far off, an answering whistle called back from another platform, as though the whole night was slowly, gently, waking to the old and familiar idea of travel. Isobel thought of her small studio back in Edinburgh, the canvases stacked quietly against the wall, the north-facing window she loved for its steady, even light. She had told no one but her sister where she was truly going, only that she meant to see the Highlands properly at last with her own eyes and her own brushes, rather than through the borrowed accounts of other travellers. There was, she thought, a particular courage in simply buying a ticket and stepping onto a platform alone, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel rather proud of it. The satchel strap settled comfortably against her shoulder, familiar now after so many years of carrying it to hillsides and harbours across the lowlands, and she found herself glad in this moment that she had packed lightly, choosing freedom of movement over any excess of comfort for the days ahead. There would be time enough later to think of canvases and commissions. For tonight, she meant only to watch and to rest and to let the journey itself be the whole of her occupation. The compartment door slid open a moment later, and a tall man in a dark grey travelling coat stepped in, removing his hat with an unhurried, courteous nod that spoke of long practice in small kindnesses. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, in a voice carrying the soft, rounded burr of the Highlands, warm as peat smoke on a cold evening. "The train is fuller than usual tonight. I believe every seat from here to Perth is already taken twice over." Isobel gestured to the seat opposite, drawing her skirts in a little to make room, and he settled with the quiet economy of a man accustomed to long journeys, setting a worn leather case beside him with the careful precision of someone who had packed and unpacked it 100 times over the years. His hands, she noticed, as he folded them loosely in his lap, were those of someone who still worked with them. Weathered, sure, marked faintly along the fingers with old calluses, the hands of a man who measured the world rather than merely admired it from a distance. He introduced himself simply, with no flourish at all. Alasdair Fenwick Muir, an engineer, returning home to Inverness after some months away, surveying a difficult stretch of line further to the south. She offered her own name in turn, and he repeated it once, quietly, almost thoughtfully, as though setting it carefully into memory for safekeeping. For a while, neither spoke further, content to let the station noise fade slowly around them. The calling porters, the hiss of steam, the distant clang of a signal bell somewhere down the line. As the final doors closed along the platform one by one, each closing carriage adding its own small, solid note to the low and gathering chorus of departure, she wondered, briefly, what had called him home after so long away, whether it was duty alone or something gentler, some pull toward familiar hills and familiar voices that no amount of professional satisfaction elsewhere could quite replace. She did not ask outright, not yet, content instead to let the question rest quietly in her mind, to be answered in its own time, if it were answered at all before Inverness. Isobel noted, too, the faint smell of coal smoke and pressed wool that seemed to belong particularly to travelling gentlemen. Not unpleasant at all, simply part of the evening's gathering atmosphere. One more small detail she suspected she would remember long afterward. With a long exhale of steam and a low shudder through the carriage floor, the train began to move, so gently at first that Isobel barely felt it, only noticed the platform lamps beginning, slowly and smoothly, to slide backward past the glass. Edinburgh unspooled past the window in soft fragments, the dark bulk of the castle upon its ancient rock, floodlit faintly against the deepening sky, the lit windows of tenements climbing the hill in uneven, comforting rows, like scattered stars fallen to earth, the last flicker of the new town's gas lamps, blurring gradually into the deepening blue of evening. Isobel pressed her gloved hand lightly to the cold glass, watching her own reflection merge slowly with the passing city, her features dissolving gently into rooftops and chimneys, and the pale distant gleam of the Firth beyond, until at last there was only darkness and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels beneath them, steady as a heartbeat, patient and unhurried, carrying them both away from everything familiar and toward the quiet, waiting unknown of the north. Alasdair had taken a small book from his coat pocket, though he did not open it yet, seeming content simply to watch the city fall gently away in silence, his gaze calm and unhurried. Isobel found she liked that about him already. that he did not feel the need to fill every quiet moment with talk, that he could simply sit and watch and let the evening settle around them both in its own good time, without hurry, without demand. The rhythm of the wheels grew steadier still, and somewhere beneath her own quiet thoughts, Isobel felt the whole long night beginning to open gently before her, mile by patient mile. She thought, watching the darkness gather, of all the journeys she had taken with her husband in years past, and found, rather to her relief, that the memory brought no sharp pain tonight, only a soft and familiar warmth, the kind that comes from love well spent, rather than love merely lost. Perhaps it was the newness of the night, or the easy company beside her, but grief seemed, for once, content to sit quietly rather than press its full weight upon her. The rhythmic sway of the carriage began already to feel less like motion and more like a kind of gentle held breath, in and out, carrying the whole compartment forward through the darkening evening without any sense of hurry at all. Isobel let her shoulders ease down at last, feeling, for the first time since leaving the house that morning, the full weight of ordinary life setting itself gently aside for the length of the journey. The line curved gently along the water, and for a time the Firth of Forth opened wide beside them, a broad silver ribbon under the slowly rising moon, its surface catching light in long, unhurried ripples that seemed to breathe with the tide. Fishing boats sat still at anchor here and there, their small lanterns swaying faintly, warm points of orange scattered across the vast, dark water like fallen embers. Alasdair broke the silence at last, nodding toward the far, dim shore. "I helped survey a stretch of line not far from here, some years back," he said. "It's strange how a place changes once you've walked every inch of it, with a theodolite in your hand and a chain over your shoulder. You begin to know the ground the way a farmer knows his own field, every dip and rise of it, every stone." Isobel smiled, opening her sketchbook to a half-finished study of the water she had begun weeks before. From a hillside above the shore, the pencil lines soft and confident. "I paint places the same way," she said, turning the book so he might see it properly. Slowly, returning again and again, until I know them better than I know most people I've been introduced to properly at a dinner table. He studied the sketch a long moment in the low lamplight, the loose, confident strokes of the water, the careful, patient rendering of the distant hills, and said nothing at first, only nodded slowly, as though the drawing had told him something quietly true about her that words alone had not yet managed to say. Outside, the water continued to slide past, endless and calm, and neither of them hurried to break the comfortable silence that followed. A heron rose suddenly from the reeds near the shore, pale against the dark water, and both of them watched it go in silence, following its slow, unhurried flight until it vanished into the deeper dark beyond the moon's reach. Such small moments, Isobel thought, were often the truest measure of a journey. Not the grand views alone, but these brief, shared instances of simply noticing the same small thing at the same small moment together. A pair of swans drifted near the far bank, pale against the dark water, entirely undisturbed by the passing train, and Isobel thought there was something quietly reassuring in creatures so evidently at peace with the noise of the modern world moving past them. The train slowed, with a long, easing sigh, as Stirling's platform lamps came into view, rows of them stretching down the dark platform like a string of small, patient moons. Beyond the station roof, faint against the darkening sky, rose the silhouette of Stirling Castle upon its ancient rock, a shape both travellers recognised at once without needing to name it aloud, familiar from 100 prints and paintings and half-remembered childhood stories told beside the fire. A few passengers stepped down onto the platform below, their voices carrying briefly through the open door before it closed again with a soft, solid click. A porter's lantern swung slowly along the length of the train, checking each carriage in turn with practiced, unhurried care. My grandmother used to say the castle watched over every traveller heading north, Isobel murmured, half to herself, her eyes still resting on the dark shape against the sky. She said no harm could come to you on the road, so long as you'd looked up at it once, properly, before setting out. Alasdair looked up at it a long moment through the glass, his expression thoughtful and quiet. It's watched over quite a few weary engineers too, I expect, he said, worrying over their gradients and their bridges long into the night, wondering if the whole thing would hold. Isobel laughed at that, a small, unguarded sound that surprised them both, breaking something loose and easy between them that had not quite been there a moment before, and the train began gently to gather speed once more as Stirling slipped slowly away behind them into the dark. A young boy on the platform waved cheerfully at the departing train, and Isobel found herself waving back through the glass before she could quite think better of it, charmed by his open, unguarded delight in the simple spectacle of a train pulling away into the night. Alasdair smiled at the sight too, and remarked that children always seemed to understand travel better than adults did, as pure adventure without the fuss and worry grown people so often attach to it. The station clock read a few minutes past the hour as they pulled away, its round face lit softly from within, and Isobel found herself, oddly, in no hurry at all to know precisely what hour it was, content simply to let the night unfold at its own pace. Isobel thought that farewells and departures, however small, always carried a little of the same bittersweet weight, whether shared between old friends or simply between a traveller and the station she was glad to have seen. As the train pulled away from Stirling, gathering its slow, steady rhythm once more beneath them, the last of the day's light faded entirely, leaving only the moon and the scattered gleam of farmhouse windows across the darkened fields beyond. The carriage rocked gently from side to side in its familiar, soothing motion, and the sound of the wheels settled into a low, hypnotic rhythm against the rails, the kind of sound that seemed to ask nothing at all of the listener but to be heard and slowly, gently forgotten. Isobel closed her sketchbook at last and let her eyes rest on the passing dark, watching the soft shapes of hedgerows and distant hills slide silently by in silhouette against the paler sky. "Do you always ride third from the engine?" she asked, curious, turning to look at him properly for the first time since Edinburgh, her tone easy now, unguarded. "Old habit," Alasdair replied, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You feel the line better there. Every curve, every gradient, every small change in the ground beneath you. long before you'd ever notice it further back. It's the closest thing to reading a landscape with your whole body, rather than only your eyes. She found she rather liked that way of seeing the world, and told him so plainly, and he seemed quietly pleased by the observation, the particular, simple pleasure that comes from being understood so easily and so soon by someone who has only just met you that same evening. Isobel found herself studying his hands again as he spoke, the sure, steady way he held them still, even in rest, and thought that there was something reassuring in a person who moved through the world with such quiet, practical confidence. It was not the confidence of vanity, she decided, but of long practice, the kind earned slowly through years of difficult, patient work, rather than claimed easily through words alone. Somewhere behind them, a late goods train sounded its own distant whistle, faint and answering, and Alasdair remarked that the night seemed full of trains calling quietly to one another across the dark countryside, each bound for its own particular corner of the waiting world. Perth station arrived in a wash of gaslight and steam, larger and busier than Stirling had been, with porters calling out connections to Dundee and Aberdeen and beyond, their voices overlapping in a cheerful, well-practiced chorus that echoed pleasantly beneath the tall iron roof. Here the train paused longer than before, long enough for passengers to step out and stretch their legs along the wide platform, their breath now visible in the cooling night air, small pale clouds rising and vanishing. Alasdair offered his arm without quite thinking about it, in the easy automatic way of a man used to steadying his footing on uneven ground, and Isobel took it without quite deciding to, the small gesture already feeling somehow comfortably familiar. They walked a short distance together along the platform, past a tea stall where the great copper urn hissed cheerfully, and the warm smell of strong tea and fresh bread drifted out invitingly into the cold, and for the first time spoke of ordinary, unremarkable things. The weather further north, the length of the journey still remaining ahead of them, the particular hush of night travel compared to the bright bustle of daytime trains. It was the kind of easy, undemanding conversation that asks nothing at all of either speaker, and yet, somehow, quietly and gently, begins everything between two people who will now spend the whole long, dark, peaceful night travelling together toward the same far horizon. Further down the platform, a young couple said their farewells beside a third-class carriage, the woman pressing a small parcel into the man's hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears, though her voice stayed admirably steady. Isobel looked away out of courtesy, but the small scene stayed with her nonetheless, a quiet reminder of how many separate lives, how many separate stories pass through a single station on any given evening, each one entirely its own. A dog trotted past them along the platform, tail wagging, clearly belonging to no one passenger in particular, but welcomed by everyone all the same, and Isobel smiled at the small, cheerful sight before they turned back toward their waiting carriage. Alasdair paused by the tea stall long enough to exchange a friendly word with the stallholder, an old acquaintance from his surveying days, and Isobel waited contentedly nearby, in no hurry at all to move on. Beyond Perth, the line followed the dark, winding curve of the River Tay, its waters catching moonlight in broken, silver pieces between the overhanging trees. the whole wide valley opening peacefully beneath a sky now thick with stars. Isobel pressed close to the window, delighted despite her tiredness. "I've painted this river from a dozen different bridges over the years," she said, "but never once seen it at night like this. Never seen it looking quite so much like something out of an old story someone might tell a child before bed." Alasdair pointed out, here and there through the glass, where the old drovers' roads once crossed the water, long before the railway had ever come through this valley at all. "My father drove cattle down this very valley as a boy," he said, his voice softening gently with the old memory. "Walking for days at a time, sleeping rough beside the herd until whatever shelter he could find. Now his son builds the very lines that carry them instead, in a fraction of the time, without a single blister to show for it at the end of the week." There was no bitterness at all in his voice, only a kind of settled, quiet wonder at how completely the world had changed beneath his own feet within a single lifetime, his father's and his own. And Isobel found herself moved unexpectedly by the tenderness with which he spoke of both the old world and the new one rising to replace it. For a while, they simply watched the river together in silence, the moon tracing its long, unhurried path along the water beside the moving train, neither feeling any particular need to speak further. Isobel found she could measure the whole evening now by these small silences, not empty at all, but full, each one a kind of quiet agreement between them that words were not always necessary to make a moment worth keeping. The scent of the river drifted faintly through the half-open window, cool and green and slightly mineral, and Isobel breathed it in slowly, thinking that certain smells belonged so entirely to certain places that no description could ever quite capture them properly on canvas. The train slowed for Dunkeld and Birnam, where the ruined arches of the old cathedral stood pale and roofless against the night sky, half swallowed by ancient trees whose great branches seemed to reach protectively over the broken, moonlit stone below. "Birnam Wood," Isobel said softly, recalling the old play at once, her eyes bright with quiet recognition, and Alasdair nodded, clearly pleased that she knew it so readily. "They say the wood still remembers," he said with a small, teasing smile, "though I've surveyed every acre of it myself several times over, and never once seen it move so much as an inch, not even in the worst of last winter's storms." They both laughed together quietly, the sound low and warm in the small, lamplit compartment. And in that shared, easy laughter, something eased further between them still, the careful formality of strangers giving way, gently and without any real effort at all, to something rather more like ease, more like the quiet, unhurried beginning of trust. Outside, the ruined cathedral slipped slowly past the window and was gone, swallowed once more by darkness and ancient trees, leaving only its pale, ghostly outline lingering a moment longer in memory before the forest closed in again around the line. Alasdair told her, too, of an old local belief that travellers who passed the ruined cathedral at midnight might hear the old bells still ringing faintly beneath the wind, though he confessed, laughing softly, that in all his years of night surveying he had never once heard so much as a whisper of them himself. Isobel said she rather hoped the story was true, nonetheless. Some things, she thought, were worth believing simply because they made the dark a little less lonely. A single bell, faint and distant, rang somewhere in the sleeping village beyond the ruins, marking some small hour of the night, and both of them fell quiet for a moment, listening to it fade slowly into the surrounding dark. Isobel said she should like to return one day by daylight, if only to see whether the ruins looked as gentle in the sun as they did tonight beneath the moon, and Alasdair said he rather thought they would. North of Dunkeld, the land began to rise steadily, and dense pine forest closed in on either side of the line, the trees black and close against the sky now thick with stars, their high tops swaying faintly in some distant, unfelt wind far above the carriage roof. The carriage lamp cast a warm, amber glow over the small compartment, cozy and private and complete against the vast, silent darkness pressing close outside the frosted glass. Isobel took out a fresh pencil and began, almost without quite meaning to sketch the shape of Alasdair's profile against the window. Not as a formal portrait exactly, but as a quiet study in concentration, the way she might once have sketched the line of a hillside or the shape of an old familiar tree, something simply worth remembering for its own quiet honesty. He noticed after a while, glancing over almost by accident, and did not mind at all, only watched her steady hand move for a moment with quiet curiosity before looking back out again at the passing forest, allowing her to finish entirely uninterrupted, as though understanding instinctively, without needing to be told, that some things are best simply observed in silence and left otherwise alone. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them, close and dark and endless, broken only by the small warm circle of lamplight inside the compartment, and Isobel found herself thinking that there was something almost sacred about travelling through such wild, unpeopled country at night, sheltered from it and yet entirely within it, at the very same time, safe within the moving light of the carriage. Somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called once, low and unhurried, and was answered a moment later from further off, the two calls passing back and forth across the dark forest like some old, patient conversation neither traveller could properly translate. Pitlochry's small station glowed warm and welcoming after the dark, close forest, its platform lamps golden against the night, a small, cheerful scattering of light, held gently in the surrounding hills. The train paused only briefly here, long enough for a porter to pass along a tray of hot tea, which Alasdair purchased for them both, without being asked, pressing a coin quietly into the porter's gloved hand, with a simple word of thanks. "My late husband loved this village," Isobel said, wrapping her gloved hands gratefully around the warm cup, the steam curling gently up between them into the lamplight. "We came here once for a whole summer and stayed in a small inn just by the river. He used to say the water here sang differently than anywhere else in all of Scotland, though I could never quite hear the difference myself." She said it easily, without sorrow in her voice at all, a memory offered gently, like a small and simple gift, rather than a wound reopened for sympathy, and Alasdair received it in exactly the same spirit, with a simple, understanding nod that asked for nothing more than whatever she chose, freely, to give of her own accord, in her own time. Alasdair asked gently whether she meant to paint on this journey at all, or simply to look, and Isobel considered the question seriously before answering that she rather thought, this time, she might only look, That some journeys, she said, were meant first to be lived quietly and painted only afterward, once the memory of them had properly settled and softened with time. The tea, strong and slightly too sweet, in the way of station tea everywhere, warmed her hands thoroughly even after the cup itself had cooled, and Isobel found she minded the sweetness rather less than she might have done at home. She thought the tea shared in such small, unhurried moments often tasted better than any offered at the finest table, simply for the warmth of the company gathered around it. Beyond Pitlochry, the line entered the steep, densely wooded gorge of Killiecrankie, the river far below catching moonlight through the thick trees in brief silver flashes that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. This pass has seen more history than most cities twice its size, Alasdair said, gazing down thoughtfully into the dark ravine. Battles, old legends, a great deal of blood long, long ago, and now simply my surveying chains and the steady, peaceful passage of this train through it all. Isobel looked down into the shadowed gorge with quiet fascination, watching the pale glint of water far below catch and lose the moon again and again. It's strange, she said slowly, thoughtfully, how a place can hold so very much within it and still feel so entirely peaceful now, so completely at rest. He considered this for a long moment, watching the dark trees slide past the glass. Perhaps that's what peace truly is, he said at last, quietly. Not the absence of history at all, but everything that ever happened here, finally settled deep into the ground, content at last simply to carry travellers gently onward, toward wherever they are going. He told her, too, of the great engineering difficulties the pass had presented to the original surveyors, the careful blasting and shoring required to carry the line safely through such steep and unstable ground. And Isobel listened with genuine interest, finding a quiet poetry in the precise, patient language of his trade, so different from her own, and yet, she thought, aiming always at the very same thing, a careful, honest rendering of the world exactly as it was. Below them, faint and constant, the sound of the river over stone rose and fell with the curves of the gorge, a sound Isobel suspected she would hear again in memory, long after the actual journey itself had properly ended. As the gorge fell behind them at last, and the land opened once more into rolling moor beneath a clear and endlessly starry sky, Alasdair spoke, quite unprompted, of his childhood near Inverness, long golden summers spent fishing patiently with his brothers along the banks of the River Ness, his mother's warm kitchen always smelling faintly of oatcakes and gentle wood smoke, the particular deep blue of the sky over the Loch in the long soft light of July evenings that never seemed to fully end. Isobel listened with her chin resting lightly on her hand, charmed entirely by the simple, unguarded warmth of it all, by the way his low voice softened and slowed whenever he spoke of home. "You speak of it the way I paint," she said softly, watching him in the lamplight, as though it were still happening, right now, somewhere just out of sight, waiting patiently to be visited again. He smiled at that, considering it seriously for a moment, and admitted quietly that it rather was, in his memory at least, that some places, he thought, never truly finished happening at all. Not really. Not for those who carried them carefully enough within themselves. Isobel asked whether he still fished, now that he was a grown man with a trade of his own. and Alasdair admitted, a little sheepishly, that he had not held a rod in years, though he still knew every good pool on the river by heart, as though the knowledge itself had simply waited patiently all this time for him to return and use it again. Isobel found herself smiling simply at the pleasure in his voice as he spoke, thinking that there was a particular kind of beauty in watching someone recall happiness so freely, without embarrassment or restraint, as though the memory itself was still entirely welcome. He added, after a moment, that he still returned to fish that same stretch of river whenever duty allowed, though the fish, he admitted with a smile, had grown noticeably more cautious over the years. The train slowed gently for Blair Atholl, where, faintly visible against the night sky, the white turrets of Blair Castle rose above the surrounding trees, pale and dreamlike in the soft moonlight, almost unreal in their quiet beauty. "The Duke still keeps his own private guard here, you know," Alasdair said, nodding toward the distant towers with a small, fond smile. "The last of its kind in all of Britain, by royal permission granted long ago." Isobel found the small detail utterly delightful, and said she should like very much indeed to paint the castle one day by full daylight, with its gardens in glorious summer bloom, the pale turrets catching warm morning sun instead of cool, distant moonlight. "Then you shall simply have to come back," Alasdair said quietly, his eyes still resting on the pale towers as they slid slowly past. And the sentence hung there, pleasantly, in the warm, close air of the compartment, neither pursued further nor withdrawn, simply set down gently between them, like a small smooth stone left quietly on a window-sill, to be picked up again later, when the time was right. Isobel imagined, briefly, what it might be like to spend a whole summer in such a place. Easels set up in the castle gardens each morning, the white turrets catching the changing light through the long, slow hours of a Highland day, and found the image so pleasant that she did not immediately banish it from her mind, as she might once have done with such an idle, hopeful thought. A single lit window showed faintly in one of the castle's lower rooms, and Isobel wondered, briefly and pleasantly, who might be awake there at such an hour, and what quiet business or comfort kept them from their own bed on so cold a night. At his gentle asking, Isobel turned her sketchbook toward him fully now, showing page after page of hills and quiet harbours and half-finished skies from journeys long past, a small fishing village on the Fife coast, a careful study of clouds gathering over Arthur's Seat, a rough charcoal sketch of her husband's folded hands from some years before, which she passed over without comment, and which he studied, in turn, without remark, understanding its quiet weight, without needing it explained to him at all. He studied each page slowly and with real attention, asking small, genuine questions as he went. Which particular light had she caught in this one? How long had she waited patiently for that exact arrangement of passing cloud? Why this quiet harbour and not some grander, more celebrated one? It was, she realized, with a small, quiet surprise, the first time in a very long while that someone had looked at her work, not simply to offer some polite, passing compliment, but truly to understand it, the way one studies a good map carefully and thoroughly before setting out on a long and unfamiliar walk through unfamiliar country. Alasdair, in turn, showed her a small folded survey map from his own case, its edges soft with handling, and traced with one finger the very line they now travelled upon, showing her where the steepest grades lay and where, years before, an early winter storm had nearly ended the whole ambitious project before it properly began. Isobel found she liked this exchange of maps and sketches, each of them showing the other, in their own particular language, how they had learned to see the world. Alasdair returned the sketchbook carefully, closing it with the same gentleness one might use for something borrowed and precious, and Isobel found the small courtesy told her more about his character than any amount of conversation could have managed alone. She thought, watching him hand it back, that a person's true character often showed itself most clearly in such small, unremarkable moments, far more than in anything grander or more deliberately performed. Past Blair Atholl, the gradient steepened noticeably beneath them, and the engine's steady breathing grew slower and deeper as it hauled the long train patiently up into wilder, emptier country. The trees thinned gradually and then vanished almost entirely from view. Bare moorland stretched away in every direction beneath the moon, silvered already with the season's first frost forming quietly in the low hollows and hidden folds of the ancient land. "We're close to the roof of the line now," Alasdair said, his voice quiet with something like genuine reverence. "Highest railway in the whole kingdom, this particular stretch, nearly 1,500 feet above the distant sea, though you'd hardly know it from in here, warm as we are." Isobel pressed her hand gently to the cold window glass, watching the empty, magnificent land unfold slowly beneath the stars, mile after silent, patient mile of it stretching away in every direction. "It feels like the edge of the world," she said softly, almost to herself, and he replied, after a long, thoughtful pause, that it rather was, the edge of one world perhaps, and the quiet, unhurried, gentle beginning of another altogether. Isobel felt, watching the bare hills rise around them, a curious lightness settle over her, as though the emptiness of the moor were not loneliness at all, but a kind of freedom, a wide, open space in which a person might finally hear her own thoughts clearly, without the constant small noise of a crowded city pressing always at the edges. The wind pressed faintly against the carriage window, a low, steady sound beneath the wheels, and Isobel thought that even the wind up here seemed to move with a kind of patience, unhurried, entirely certain of where it was eventually going. The carriage lamp was turned low now, dimmed to little more than a soft amber glow, and beyond the window, the sky opened wide into a vast and glittering field of stars, entirely undimmed by any city light for miles and miles in every direction. Neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to watch the dark moor slide silently by, beneath that enormous, star-strewn ceiling stretched high. Above, the only sound in the whole compartment, the steady, gentle clatter of the wheels below, patient and unhurried and endlessly repeating. Isobel thought, not for the first time that long night, how truly rare it was to sit in such comfortable, easy silence with someone so newly met, so recently a stranger. Not the anxious silence of having nothing left to say, but the far gentler, far kinder silence of not needing to say it yet, of trusting quietly that there would be time enough later for words and time enough after that for more, should either of them wish it. Alasdair pointed out, quietly, a handful of constellations he had learned to navigate by during his years of night surveying, tracing their shapes against the glass with one finger, and Isobel found herself charmed by the easy, unshowy way he shared the knowledge without any need to impress, simply glad, it seemed, to share something he loved with someone willing to look up and see it too. Isobel found her own breathing slowing gradually to match the rhythm of the wheels, each breath a little longer and easier than the last, until the whole compartment seemed to breathe together as one, quiet and unhurried beneath the enormous sky. Somewhere far off, so faint it might almost have been imagined, a distant train whistle answered their own, two small sounds passing each other somewhere out in the vast, starlit dark. Dalwhinnie's small station stood entirely alone on the high, empty moor, the loneliest and coldest stop on the whole long line, its single lamp swinging faintly in a wind that seemed to come from nowhere at all, and everywhere at once. Coldest inhabited spot in all of Britain, they say, Alasdair remarked gently, drawing the compartment's woolen blanket a little higher across her knees, without asking permission first. Though I've always found it strangely beautiful in its own bareness, there's nothing at all here to distract you from the sky, nothing to compete with it for your attention. Isobel agreed entirely, watching the small, empty platform recede slowly into darkness as the train pulled gently away once more, carrying them both deeper still into the deep, wide hush of the high country, where nothing at all stirred but the wind and the patient, watching starlight above. Isobel pulled her coat a little closer and thought, not unhappily, of how strange and wonderful it was to find such comfort in the presence of a man she had known for only a handful of hours, and yet felt already as though she might have known him a great deal longer than that, in some quieter, more patient way than ordinary time could properly measure. A single sheep bleated somewhere out on the dark moor as the train drew away from the small station, the sound carrying strangely far in the still cold air, before fading gently into silence behind them. The night had grown properly cold now, the chill seeping faintly even through the well-fitted carriage windows, and Alasdair, without ceremony or the slightest awkwardness, offered half the woolen blanket from his own seat, moving quietly to sit beside her rather than opposite, so that they might share its gathered warmth more easily between them. Isobel accepted it gladly, drawing it close around them both, and for a good while they simply sat together in a warm, companionable silence, watching the dark moor pass slowly beneath the stars, saying very little, needing to say very little at all. It was, she thought quietly, a particular and quite unhurried kind of intimacy, not romance exactly, not yet, not quite, but something gentler still, and perhaps more valuable altogether. The simple, settled ease of two people who were, somewhere in the quiet miles now behind them, no longer strangers to one another in any way that mattered. Neither of them remarked upon the closeness of it, the shared warmth beneath the blanket, though both were quietly and pleasantly aware of it, and the awareness itself seemed enough for now, needing no further acknowledgement beyond the simple, comfortable fact of it, there in the moving dark, mile after gentle mile. Isobel noticed, distantly, that her own hands had stopped feeling cold some time ago, warmed thoroughly now by the shared blanket and by something else besides, something she did not yet have the words to properly name. "He was a good man, my husband," Isobel said quietly into the warm dark of the small compartment. "Fond of maps, rather like you, though he never quite had your gift for making them properly. He used to say that every journey was really just a slow, patient way of coming home to yourself, one quiet mile at a time." Alasdair listened, without interrupting once, his eyes gentle and attentive in the low lamplight, and when she finished speaking, said only softly, "That sounds like a man well worth missing, and well worth remembering so fondly all these years later." She nodded slowly, watching the dark moor slide past the frosted window, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the missing felt somehow lighter now for having been spoken aloud at last, here in the moving dark, to someone who simply let it exist beside them both, without ever trying to mend it or hurry it gently along before its own time. Alasdair, after a moment, admitted quietly that he had never married, though he had once, some years before, come close, and that the disappointment of it had taught him, if nothing else, a certain patience with his own heart, a willingness to wait for the right quiet understanding rather than settle for the easy comfort of the merely convenient. For a while afterward, neither of them spoke at all, and the silence held nothing uncomfortable within it, only the settled ease of something honestly said and gently, fully received by someone willing to simply listen. Isobel added, softly, that she had come to think grief and gratitude were closer cousins than most people supposed, each one simply another way of holding tightly to something that had mattered. In turn, Alasdair spoke of the railway itself, the long years spent surveying these very hills entirely on foot, the endless golden summers with chain and theodolite, and only a small canvas tent for shelter against the weather, the bitter winter storms that had twice buried his careful, patient work under deep drifting snow, before the following spring uncovered it again, quite undisturbed, waiting patiently all along to be finished properly at last. "There's a particular satisfaction in it," he said, his voice thoughtful and low, "in laying a path through country that resisted you at every single turn, and knowing, afterward, that it will carry ordinary travellers safely home for 100 years or more, long after you and I are both entirely forgotten by everyone." Isobel found herself deeply moved by the quiet, steady pride in his voice as he spoke of it all, not boastful in the slightest degree, only true, only fully earned through years of patient, difficult labour in country that gave nothing at all easily to those who came to tame it. Isobel said she thought there was something almost like painting in what he described, this business of shaping raw, resistant country into something that could carry people gently onward, and Alasdair, considering the comparison, said he had never thought of it in quite those terms before, but found, turning it over, that he rather liked the idea very much indeed. Isobel thought that she had never before heard a man speak of his work with such plain, unadorned affection, without any need to make it sound grander than it truly was, and found she trusted him rather more for it. Isobel said she thought every good bridge and every good painting shared the same quiet ambition, to make something difficult look, afterward, as though it had always simply belonged exactly where it now stood. Moonlight caught the long, dark surface of Loch Ericht as the line ran briefly alongside its quiet shore, the water utterly still and black beneath the surrounding hills, mirroring the scattered stars so perfectly and so completely that it seemed, for one long moment, as though the train travelled gently between two identical, mirrored skies. "I surveyed this shoreline 3 summers running," Alasdair said softly, watching the still, dark water slide past the glass. "I still dream of it sometimes, even now, after everything. The particular quiet of it, the strange way sound itself seems to simply vanish the moment it touches that water." Isobel watched the Loch slide silently past, silver and black in perfect, equal measure, and thought drowsily that she understood entirely now why a place so beautiful and so completely still might follow a person gently into sleep, night after peaceful night, for years and years afterward, long after the journey itself was over. She asked whether he had ever been tempted to leave engineering altogether and simply live somewhere as quiet and beautiful as the Loch shore, and Alasdair admitted, smiling faintly, that he thought about it more often than he cared to say, though something in him always returned, in the end, to the deep satisfaction of the work itself, difficult as it so often was. A fish rose somewhere near the Loch's dark centre, the ripples spreading outward in slow, widening rings, visible even in the moonlight, and both of them watched it in silence until the water stilled again completely. The train settled at last into a long, steady stretch of open moor, and the whole carriage grew quiet around them both. Other passengers dozing peacefully in their seats. Further down the softly lit corridor, the lamp turned low. The world outside reduced now to simple, dark shapes of hill and drifting cloud beneath the endless, patient stars above. Isobel felt her own eyes growing pleasantly heavy at last, lulled gently by the steady rhythm of the wheels and the warmth of the shared blanket resting beside her. "Sleep, if you like," Alasdair said softly, his low voice barely rising above the steady sound of the train itself. "I'll wake you gently before Kingussie. I give you my word." She thanked him quietly, grateful, and let her eyes close at last, comforted rather than diminished by the simple, unhurried offer, trusting him already, she realized, in a way that rather surprised her, this far into so short and strange a night. Somewhere further down the corridor, a child murmured softly in sleep, and a mother's low voice answered, soothing, barely audible above the wheels, and Isobel found the small, distant sound oddly comforting, a quiet reminder that the whole train moved together through the night, each compartment its own small world, all of them bound gently toward the very same morning. The steady rhythm of the wheels seemed, in the deep quiet of midnight, to grow gentler still, as though the whole train itself were easing its pace out of some quiet courtesy toward its sleeping passengers. Isobel thought, drifting toward sleep, the trust given so easily and so early in an acquaintance was rare enough to be worth noticing, and rarer still to be worth keeping. She woke only briefly as the train slowed gently for Newtonmore, its handful of lit windows glowing warmly against the dark hillside like scattered, patient embers in the night. A dog barked once, somewhere near the small station, and then fell still again, almost at once, the whole night settling gently back into its own deep, patient quiet. Alasdair had not moved at all from beside her, keeping careful, quiet watch exactly as he had promised, and Isobel settled back gently against the warm seat, comforted deeply by his simple steadiness. by the mere quiet fact of his presence there beside her in the dark, and let sleep take her again almost at once, entirely unhurried, entirely untroubled by anything at all. In her half-sleep, she dreamed briefly and pleasantly of the Loch they had passed some hours before, its still black water holding the whole sky within it. And when she woke a little further on, she could not have said for certain where the dream had ended and the true remembered journey had properly begun. Somewhere far off, a fox called once into the night, sharp and brief, and was gone again before Isobel had fully registered the sound, already halfway back into the soft, easy comfort of sleep. At Kingussie, the platform lamps were bright enough to rouse her gently from sleep, and she watched, half dreaming still, as a local farmer loaded milk churns onto the train with slow, practiced, unhurried ease, his breath rising visible in the cold, morning-scented air outside. Alasdair pointed out quietly, in a low voice, careful not to wake the other dozing passengers nearby, the shape of the old church spire rising against the sky, and told her a small, gentle story about a wedding he had once attended there, years and years before, in the very height of summer, with the whole surrounding valley smelling sweetly of freshly cut hay. Isobel listened with drowsy, entirely contented pleasure, the small, warm story blending softly and easily into the pleasant edges of her half-sleep, warm and unhurried and complete. The farmer touched his cap to them both as the train pulled away, and Isobel, still drowsy, thought there was something quietly moving in the simple, unremarkable courtesy of it, a small kindness exchanged between strangers who would likely never meet again, and yet were, for that one brief moment, entirely and freely generous with one another. The cold morning air carried faintly through the window the smell of wood smoke from some nearby cottage, and Isobel thought drowsily that few smells in the world spoke so plainly and so warmly of home. Beyond Kingussie, the great dark shapes of the Cairngorms mountains rose steadily against the northern sky, ancient and enormous, their upper slopes already pale with the season's early snow, catching the faint, fading light of the setting moon as it sank slowly toward the western hills. The oldest mountains in all of Britain, Alasdair murmured, his voice soft with genuine quiet reverence, worn round and gentle now by more winters than either of us could ever hope to properly count. Isobel gazed at them with sleepy, quiet wonder, thinking, in the soft haze of her own drowsiness, that there was something deeply and simply comforting in mountains so very old, a gentle, patient reminder that whatever this single strange night held for the two of them, the wide world had already seen a great many nights before it, and would surely go on seeing a great many more long after. Alasdair said that his mother used to point out the mountains to him as a boy and tell him they had watched over every soul who had ever lived in this valley, and would watch over every soul yet to come. And Isobel thought it a fine thing to believe, whether or not it was strictly true, and said so quietly, and he agreed. Alasdair fell quiet for a while after speaking, simply watching the mountains, and Isobel let him, understanding instinctively that some views asked to be received in silence, rather than filled immediately with further words. Isobel said quietly that she hoped to paint them herself one day, though she suspected no canvas could ever quite hold the particular hush of seeing them like this, alive with starlight and old snow. Somewhere past midnight, A porter passed quietly along the softly lit corridor with a final tray of tea for those passengers still awake, and Alasdair woke Isobel gently to share it, the warm cup passing carefully between them, a small, comforting ceremony in the dark, gently rocking carriage. They spoke very little as they drank together, sipping slowly in comfortable, easy silence, the taste of strong, warm tea and the low, constant murmur of the moving train blending together into something Isobel knew, even then, half asleep as she was, that she would remember fondly and clearly for a very long time after the journey itself had ended and quietly become only memory. The porter, an older man with a kind, weathered face, lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary, remarking softly that it was a fine, clear night for the crossing, the best he'd seen all autumn, before moving on down the corridor with his tray, and Isobel found she agreed with him entirely, wholly and simply. The porter's lantern swung gently as he moved away down the corridor, casting long, soft shadows that slid briefly across the compartment walls before settling again into stillness and quiet. Too drowsy now to sketch properly, her pencil resting still and forgotten in her lap, Isobel instead described to Alasdair, in a soft, unhurried half-whisper, the painting she meant to make of this very journey once she reached her studio again. The silver loch caught perfectly between two mirrored skies, the star-filled moor stretching away endlessly in every direction, the warm lamp glowing steadily and patiently between them through the whole long, quiet night. He listened with his eyes half closed now, adding small, quiet details of his own here and there as she spoke. The exact pale colour of the frost at Dalwhinnie, the particular low sound the wheels had made crossing the old viaduct, until neither of them could quite tell any longer whose gentle memory the imagined painting truly belonged to, hers or his, or perhaps, by now, some quiet and easy blending of the two together. Alasdair suggested, half teasing, that she ought to paint him into the picture somewhere, however small, and Isobel laughed softly and said she rather thought she might, though she would have to decide first whether to paint him awake or asleep, since she could not yet tell which he preferred to be remembered as. Isobel realized, describing the imagined painting aloud, that she had never once spoken her work into being quite like this before, and found the practice rather lovely, a new and gentle way of seeing something before it existed. The station at Aviemore came and went quietly in a fragrant hush of pine, the dense forest pressing close and green around the small platform, even in the full darkness of night. Isobel breathed in the sharp, clean scent through the half-open window, filling her lungs slowly and gratefully with the cold, resinous air. Alasdair told her, quietly and warmly, of childhood summers spent gathering pine cones here with his brothers for their mother's kitchen fire. A memory so simple and so warm in the gentle telling of it that it seemed to settle softly over the whole small compartment, like the shared blanket still wrapped around them both, softening every remaining edge of the long, patient night. He confessed that he still kept a small tin of pine cones somewhere in his rooms in Inverness, gathered years ago and never quite thrown away. And Isobel said she thought that a lovely, foolish sort of thing to keep, and meant it entirely as a compliment, which he seemed to understand without her needing to explain further. The pine scent lingered even after the station had slipped from view, caught somehow in the folds of the blanket and the wool of their coats, a small, fragrant reminder of the forest they now left behind. Alasdair said his brothers still lived nearby, one a joiner, the other a shepherd, and that between the two of them and the railway, very little in the valley moved without a Fenwick Muir having some hand in it. The line ran briefly beside the river Spey, its dark waters catching small fragments of moonlight through the passing birch trees, the faint sound of it just barely audible beneath the train's own steady, rhythmic murmur. "My grandfather fished this river his whole life," Alasdair said softly, watching the dark waters slide past the glass. "Never caught a great deal, by his own cheerful admission, but never much cared either way, so long as he was standing in the water with the sky above him." Isobel smiled, her eyes half closed now, warm and drowsy and entirely content. "I think that's very likely the whole secret to a happy life," she murmured softly, caring rather more for the river itself than for whatever small thing it might eventually give you in return. Isobel said she thought rivers made the best teachers of patience, since they never hurried and yet always arrived exactly where they meant to go, and Alasdair agreed, adding that he had learned more about proper engineering from watching water find its own way through difficult ground than from any book he had ever studied. A kingfisher, unseen but for a flash of blue against the dark water, darted low along the Spey and was gone, too quick for either of them to properly exclaim over before it had vanished entirely from sight. For a long while after, neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together in the warm, gently swaying dark, the forest and the river passing quietly unseen now beyond the softly frosted glass. It was, Isobel thought drowsily, exactly the particular and rather precious kind of silence that only ever forms between two people who have already said quite enough over the course of one long night to trust each other fully and completely with the quiet that naturally follows. A silence entirely without edges to it, without waiting, without any need at all, only rest, deep and simple and shared. The lamp flickered once, gently, and steadied again, and neither of them so much as glanced toward it, both entirely at ease within the small, warm world of the compartment, content to let the whole vast, dark night continue on outside, without requiring their attention or their comment. The silence stretched on, unbroken and entirely comfortable, until it no longer felt like an absence of conversation at all, but rather like its own quiet, complete, and satisfying kind of company. Isobel thought that some of the best conversations she had ever had contained hardly any words at all, only this same easy, unhurried quiet shared willingly between two people glad of each other's company. The old stone bridge at Carrbridge appeared briefly in the pale moonlight, humped and ancient and weathered, older even than the railway itself by several long centuries. Built for pack horses, long, long before any of this, Alasdair murmured quietly, nodding toward it as it slid slowly past the window and into shadow again. Isobel watched it pass with sleepy, gentle fascination, imagining, in the soft haze of her own near sleep, all the quiet centuries of travellers who had crossed it slowly before her, each one on their own small and now entirely forgotten journey north, each carrying their own quiet hopes carefully into the waiting dark ahead of them. Alasdair said his own grandfather had helped repair that very bridge as a young man long before the railway came, and Isobel thought it a fine thing that this quiet corner of the world had been shaped in its own small way by generations of the very same family, each one adding something modest and lasting to the land. Isobel imagined briefly painting the old bridge itself one day in full summer light, pack horses and all, a small tribute to the quiet, patient generations who had built and mended it long before any railway came through. The train laboured gently and patiently up the final rise towards Loch, the highest point on the whole entire line, the engines steady breathing slow and deep, and even in the thin cold night air surrounding them. "From here," Alasdair said softly, his voice now barely more than a low whisper, "it's downhill all the way to Inverness, every remaining mile of it easier than the very last." Isobel, nearly asleep now, warm beneath the shared woolen blanket, found deep and simple comfort in the thought that after every long, patient, difficult climb, however winding and however slow it had been, there came at last a gentle, well-earned, and thoroughly deserved easing. Isobel murmured something about how fitting it seemed that the hardest part of any journey so often came just before the easiest, and Alasdair, only half awake himself now, agreed softly that he had found the very same thing true of most things worth doing at all in life. The air in the compartment felt thinner somehow at the summit, sharper and colder, despite the warmth of the shared blanket, and Isobel drew it in slowly, savouring the strange, clean bite of it. Alasdair said that engineers were taught to measure a line by its steepest grade, but that he had always thought a journey was better measured by whatever lay waiting at its gentlest, easiest end. The train began its long, gentle descent at last, the wheels settling into a smoother, faster, altogether more restful rhythm as the land began, almost imperceptibly at first, to fall gradually away toward the distant, waiting coast. Isobel felt the quiet change in her own body before she quite understood it, fully in her mind. A soft loosening, a gentle unwinding, the particular and deeply welcome relief of a long night's journey nearing its own unhurried gentle end. At last, nothing at all left now, but the last few quiet miles remaining between them and morning. She felt the shared blanket slipping slightly and did not move to adjust it, comfortable exactly as she was, listening to the changed rhythm of the wheels beneath them, faster now, lighter, as though the train itself sensed the nearness of morning and welcomed it gladly. Isobel felt, quite suddenly, entirely unafraid of whatever the morning might bring, trusting the ease of the night behind her to carry forward, gently, into whatever came next for them both. Isobel thought that descents, in life as on the railway, so often felt like relief rather than loss, the easier going a fair and welcome reward for all the earlier, harder climbing. Somewhere past the small station at Moy, the faintest edge of dawn began to touch the eastern sky at last, a pale grey seam appearing quietly and gradually along the distant, sleeping hilltops. Alasdair noticed it first, watching through half-closed, tired eyes, and pointed it out to her softly and gently, careful not to startle her from her own warm, drowsy peace. And together, in easy and comfortable silence, they watched the long darkness begin, ever so slowly and so gently, to soften at last into the first pale colours of morning. Alasdair said quietly that he had seen a great many Highland dawns in his years of surveying, and that not one of them had ever quite managed to become ordinary to him, however many times he watched the sky soften in just this way, and Isobel said she hoped, for her own part, never to grow used to it either. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply watching the grey light strengthen slowly along the hills, both entirely willing to let the silence hold the whole soft moment for as long as it wished to. The hills began at last to gentle and soften into rolling farmland, stone cottages appearing here and there in the pale early light, with a single lit window glowing warm against the grey morning air. Early risers already beginning their own quiet daily tasks somewhere within. Isobel watched it all with quiet, drowsy tenderness, feeling, for the very first time in the whole long, peaceful journey, the gentle and welcome nearness of arrival settling softly and warmly over her at last. A rooster crowed somewhere in the near distance, faint and cheerful, and Isobel smiled at the small, homely sound, thinking that there was something rather wonderful in how quickly a wild, empty landscape could soften into something so gentle and inhabited, simply with the coming of morning light. Isobel thought that farmland at dawn had a particular gentleness to it that no other hour ever quite managed, everything softened and forgiven somehow by the pale, patient arrival of morning light. Alasdair said the lowlands always struck him as gentler company after the wildness of the high moor, though he confessed he loved them both equally, each for entirely different reasons. At last, the wide silver gleam of the Moray Firth opened out beyond the fields, catching the very first true colours of sunrise upon its calm, unhurried surface, soft rose and pale gold spreading slowly and gently along the water's distant edge. Almost home, Alasdair said quietly, and there was something warm and entirely unguarded in his low voice, something without the slightest pretense at all, that made the simple word feel as though it might, just possibly, in time, come to include her too, should she wish it so. Isobel said softly that she thought the colours of a Highland dawn put most paintings to shame, her own included, and Alasdair said he rather doubted that, though he understood. He said exactly why she might feel it standing here, watching the light spread so generously across the water before them. She thought, watching the colours spread, that she would remember this exact shade of rose and gold for the rest of her life, whatever else the coming years might bring her. Alasdair said the fishermen already out on the Firth would have seen 1,000 such mornings, and yet, he suspected, still paused most days to watch the colours properly before returning to their nets. The train's steady rhythm slowed further still as the outskirts of Inverness came gradually into gentle view, rooftops and church spires catching the first warm light of morning, thin pale smoke rising quietly from 100 waking chimneys across the whole slowly stirring town. Isobel gathered her sketchbook slowly, almost reluctantly, feeling in some small and quiet way she could not quite name, a gentle sadness that the long, peaceful, shared night was drawing so surely and so gently now to its close. She realized, gathering her things, that she had not thought once of the address awaiting her in Inverness, nor of anything at all beyond this particular carriage and this particular night, and found the realization itself rather pleasant, a sign, perhaps, of just how completely the journey had held her attention. Alasdair, watching her gather her things, said quietly that he hoped the night had given her something worth keeping, and Isobel assured him, just as quietly, that it had given her a very great deal indeed. The train drew at last into Inverness, beneath a sky now fully touched with soft, warm dawn colour, the platform bright and already busy even at this early hour, porters calling cheerfully and carriage doors opening all along its considerable length. Alasdair helped her carefully down onto the platform with the very same unhurried courtesy he had shown her at the start of their long journey together the evening before, and for one quiet moment they simply stood side by side in the soft gold morning light, travellers no longer strangers to one another in any real sense, sharing between them now the settled, quiet ease of a long night well and gently spent. For a moment, neither of them moved to walk on, simply standing together amid the bustle of the platform, in no particular hurry to let the quiet ease of the night give way entirely to the practical business of the day now properly beginning around them. The morning bustle of the station rose gently around them, porters and passengers, and the cheerful clatter of the new day beginning, and neither of them hurried to step fully into it just yet. A church bell, somewhere in the town, struck the hour softly, unhurried, as if it too understood that no one on the platform this particular morning had any real wish to be rushed. Perhaps, Alasdair said at last, as porters called cheerfully around them and steam drifted gently up into the fresh morning air, you might paint Blair Castle after all, one summer, in full daylight this time, with the gardens in bloom exactly as you wished to see them. Isobel smiled warmly, tucking a loose strand of hair carefully beneath her bonnet, feeling the whole warm promise of the morning settling softly around her at last. Perhaps I might need a good guide then, she said gently. Someone who knows the country as thoroughly and as fondly as you do. He offered his arm once more, easily, just as he had at Perth so many quiet hours before, and together, entirely unhurried, they walked out into the waking streets of Inverness, the whole quiet, gentle promise of morning, and of some further shared journey yet still to come, opening softly and peacefully before them both, mile by gentle mile, exactly as the night before had done.